Hey, we are live streaming in 3, 2, 1, action.
Good evening and welcome to the Hendrick Hudson PTA Advocacy Committee's first public forum on Indian Point. My name is Lisa Anderson and I'm one of 4 co-chairs of the Advocacy Committee, and I have been a resident of this community for almost 16 years. Tonight's program was organized in partnership with the Decommissioning Oversight Board. We thank Tom Kazmary, Executive Director of Indian Point Decommissioning Oversight Board, for his assistance in coordinating the speakers we have here tonight. The closure of Indian Point has had a dramatic effect and impact on our community. I know many of us distinctly recall when we first heard the news of its closure 6 years ago. We all want to make sure that decommissioning happens safely so that our families, homes, and communities are protected. Thank you for joining us tonight. I will now turn the time over to Tom Kazmary to introduce our guests and their role in the Decommissioning Oversight Board. They'll give a short presentation, after which we will begin responding to the pre-submitted questions. We will conclude that portion of the evening by 8:30 p.m. so we can reserve our final half hour for additional questions from the floor. Please be sure to sign up if you wish to ask a question in person so that we can call you up.
Thank you, Lisa. And let me return that thanks also to Janine Eichenholz, who unfortunately I believe had another conflict tonight, and Jess Burbeck from the Parent Teacher Association, and the acting school superintendent Dennis Lara for facilitating this important public forum tonight. While Janine is unfortunately unable to participate tonight, she really was integral in organizing this event. By way of introduction, I am Tom Kazmary, Policy Advisor at the New York State Department of Public Service and Executive Director of the Indian Point Decommissioning Oversight Board. Our Chair, Tom Congdon, could not be here in person tonight due to family obligations, but he is online in the virtual audience. Before we begin, I want to address a concern that was raised by several members of the community earlier today regarding a citation in Indian Point in May of last year. Please know that there was not a release of radioactivity to the environment. 2 weeks ago, the NRC issued a written inspection report that is also now available on our website, dps.ny.gov/Indian Point. Provide that later as well. The NRC report included a federal citation for an incident on site in May of last year. An overflow of a storage tank resulted in a localized spill of radioactive water. The overflow fluid was contained within an enclosed building. The NRC reviewed this event and assigned it a severity level 4 citation, which is the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission defines as an event of very low safety significance and is the lowest level of all of their citations. The NRC has protocols for when to immediately inform the public about events that can impact the public. This incident did not trigger those protocols. Again, please note that there was no release of radioactivity to the environment. Nonetheless, New York State and the DOB take all violations seriously and appreciate the concern of the community and the need for transparency and context when a violation occurs. This is why we asked Holtec to include and note it in their reports to the DOB. Holtec did include this incident in the presentation slides to the DOB on February 2nd, which is also available on our website, noting TBD since the NRC report had not yet come out. Given the report is now out, we've asked Holtec to explain the citation in more detail at our next DOB meeting scheduled for April 27th. The Decommissioning Oversight Board was created by the Department of Public Service and inspired by legislation introduced by Senator Harkin and now retired Assemblywoman Gaylor. Its purpose is to provide a forum for information sharing between involved agencies, to identify issues for relevant oversight agencies to address, and to help inform the public about decommissioning, spent fuel management, and site restoration. Before I introduce our panel, I'm going to speak briefly about how the DOB was formed and why. The DOB was formed by the Department of Public Service, which is the staff arm of the Public Service Commission, because it was the state agency responsible for reviewing and approving the sale of the Indian Point Power Plant The Department and Public Service Commission may review sales of nuclear power facilities in the state to ensure such sales are in the public interest. In this case, the petition to the Public Service Commission by Holtec and Entergy came after Entergy had already agreed to close the nuclear facilities through an agreement settling litigation between the state of New York, Riverkeeper, and Entergy. In 2021, the Public Service Commission approved a unanimous agreement of all parties in the case to approve the planned sale to Holtec, subject to a number of conditions. The parties to the agreement included Holtec, DEC, Westchester County, the town of Portland, the village of Buchanan, Hendrick Hudson School District, the Public Utility Law Project, the State Attorney General, Riverkeeper, and the Department of Public Service. The parties all agreed that there were significant public interest benefits associated with the conditional sale of the plant, including, among others, Holtec's plan to immediately transfer spent fuel from cooling pools to dry cask storage and commence decommissioning promptly. Maintaining a minimum balance of no less than $400 million in the decommissioning trust fund for 10 years. Maintaining a minimum balance of no less than $360 million in the decommissioning trust fund at partial site release for the NRC for costs related to waste management and radiological cleanup of the site, and conducting site restoration and remediation under an order on consent with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which will oversee the hazardous materials and residual radiation cleanup at Indian Point, including through the use of an on-site monitor. In sum, the parties in the proceeding all agreed that this was in the public interest to commence decommissioning promptly, rather than wait up to 60 years to start decommissioning. And the parties also saw the opportunity to obtain many safeguards that the federal government did not require when it approved the transfer of the NRC license to Holtec, including keeping a very close eye on the trust fund balances to ensure there will be sufficient resources to thoroughly decommission and remediate the site. This important agreement set the tone for the decommissioning oversight board and state agencies to take actions that are attentive to the community questions and grounded in objective facts and sound science. For example, the Department of Public Service agreed with a recommendation from the public stakeholders to the DOB to hire a state on-site inspector to monitor decommissioning activities. Although NRC continues to provide important regular inspections, the federal regulator pulled their resident inspector after the plant stopped operating, given the much lower safety risks. But the state believed that an on-site regulator presence was important to ensure real-time compliance and best practices. So we've had a daily on-site presence as a state regulator since early 2022. We strengthened local building demolition permits to have better enforcement mechanisms of dust control. We established a school monitoring working group to review air monitoring in place and advise on what changes should be considered for each stage of decommissioning to be relevant to the risks presented by those activities. The state team is now working to develop a community monitoring program based on the working group's recommendations, funded in part by a $500,000 grant. We established clear communication linkages between Holtec and Enbridge, the company that operates the gas pipelines in the vicinity of the decommissioning site, including a detailed memorandum of understanding between the two companies that protects the pipeline from heavy load crossings and other activities. Our independent technical expert has agreed to provide regular briefings to the DOB and stakeholders in the community, and his independent research and presentations are available on the DOB's website for public review. He has made himself available to talk to the community on several occasions and is here virtually with us tonight. Just as important as our robust oversight activities is our commitment to public engagement. It is in this spirit that we are here tonight. It is clear that the parent community within the school district has questions about the decommissioning process. To provide unbiased, factual information to the community, we have worked with the school district and parent-teacher association to offer public forums from time to time, and this will be the first. Our independent expert, David Lockbaum, has researched the issues of interest in the school community in depth and is with us virtually tonight to provide an overview of the issues we have heard most frequently from the school community. In addition, we have assembled a panel of subject matter experts from the Department of Environmental Conservation, Department of Public Service, and Department of Health to answer questions that were submitted in advance or may come up tonight. We greatly appreciate to be with you tonight, and we hope that we help to provide a greater understanding of the issues of concern. Wherever necessary, we will take issues back for further research if we cannot answer on the spot tonight. Joining us tonight are representatives from Senator Harkin's office. We have the interim superintendent is with us as well. Thank you very much. While we were unable to, there were a number of individuals unable to join in person due to legislative commitments. We do have members of Senator Harkin's and Assemblywoman Levenberg's staffs also joining us virtually tonight, in addition to Tino. A number of state experts are also available to field questions this evening. I'm joined by my colleagues John Sipos, counsel to the DOE. Thank you, John. Next, we have Kelly Turturro with the DEC joining us today. And we have Alex Damiani and Cindy Costello from the Department of Health. Susan Spear with Westchester County Emergency Services is joining us as well. Welcome, Susan. With that, let's turn to a presentation from Dave Lockbaum, pre-recorded. Dave Lockbaum is a retired nuclear engineer and former director of the Nuclear Safety Project for the Union of Concerned Scientists. He currently serves as the independent technical expert for the decommissioning oversight board. Thank you.
Is this the video that you want to play first?
Yes. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Hello, I am Dave Lockbaum, the non-compensated independent technical expert on the Decommissioning Oversight Board. I have a nuclear engineering degree and worked for over 17 years in the nuclear power industry, including a consulting role in the mid-90s on Fitzpatrick and Indian Point in New York. For over 20 years, I was the nuclear safety advocate for the nonprofit Union of Concerned Scientists. I also worked for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, teaching reactor technology to NRC employees. This presentation provides my perspectives and may not reflect the views of other Decommissioning Oversight Board members. This graphic from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission plots the risk during initial fuel loading, reactor operation, decommissioning, and then during dry storage of spent fuel. Risk is defined as the probability of an accident times its consequences. As explained in the next slides, both the probability and the consequences of accidents decrease after a reactor permanently shuts down. The higher energy level of an operating reactor is 138 times higher than in a spent fuel pool. The energy level in a spent fuel pool is 60 to 100 times higher than in a dry cask. The lower the energy level, the more time is available to successfully intervene to prevent an accident, and the less force is available to disperse radioactivity should the time run out and disaster happen anyway. Stated another way, the energy level of the spent fuel in each dry cask is less than 1/100th of the energy level of an operating reactor. The number of fuel assemblies in a reactor core is 6 times higher than in each dry cask. The Unit 2 spent fuel pool is now empty, as its fuel assemblies have been transferred into dry casks. Holtec's plan is to complete the transfer of spent fuel assemblies from the Unit 3 spent fuel pool into dry casks later this year. The radioactive byproducts from atom splitting in an operating reactor decay over time. This chart has rows of radionuclides sorted by decreasing half-lives, the amount of time needed for decay. The columns are increasing time since reactor shutdown. The particles and energy waves emitted by decay of radionuclides can cause harm, but the green shaded boxes show harmless radionuclides. The green boxes at the top indicate radionuclides that have not yet decayed, while the green shaded boxes at the bottom indicate radionuclides that have entirely decayed away. The white shaded boxes identify the radionuclides posing potential harm if released. Federal regulations require that pathways for releases to the air and water be monitored for radioactivity. If high radioactivity levels are detected, valves or dampers in the pathways will be closed to terminate the releases. The Indian Point site is circled by a ring of Reuter-Stokes continuous radiation monitors. These monitors are located 1/2 to 2.5 miles from the site. Two of the Reuter-Stokes monitors are located near the school. The picture on the right shows the pole-mounted station number 9 near the Buchanan Verplanck Elementary School. The prevailing winds are not generally towards the elementary school. Regardless of which direction and speed the wind is blowing, the federal regulations on amounts of radioactivity that can be released and the monitoring of release pathways ensure the public is protected while at school, while at work, and while at home. The continuous radiation levels from the 16 Reuter-Stokes monitors, along with information on wind speed and direction, can be accessed by local and state officials. Holtec's emergency plan requires local and state officials to be notified within 15 minutes after an emergency declaration. Dust is controlled by local, state, and federal requirements. Safety protocols protecting workers during decommissioning activities also protect the school and community. The Village of Buchanan issues permits for demolition work that prohibit fugitive dust from leaving the site. The Community Air Monitoring Plan, the demolition permit process, and the on-site state inspector are measures not commonly used at other plants during decommissioning. Such measures provide additional protection for workers and the public. Federal regulations require off-site sampling of water, soil, aquatic wildlife, and vegetation. If illegal releases of radioactivity occurred, or if legal releases resulted in concentration or bioaccumulation of radioactivity, this sampling would detect it. The state of New York independently samples water and aquatic wildlife as a further check against harmful releases of radioactivity. Federal regulations require owners to submit 2 annual reports to the NRC, who posts the reports online by nuclear plant site. The radioactive effluent reports describe the amounts of various radionuclides released to the air and water or shipped off-site as solid waste. The environmental reports describe the results from sampling. They also show the trends from sampling results over the prior decade. The annual effluent reports for 2005 through 2019 show the tritium concentrations in water filtered and discharged from Indian Point were less than 4% of the EPA drinking water standard. The ample margin means that even if the current limit was cut in half and the releases increased by a factor of 10, the discharges would still be within permitted amounts. The annual environmental reports of sampling results show there's no bioaccumulation or concentration of radioactivity released from Indian Point. Liquids released from Indian Point are filtered to minimize the amounts of radioactivity discharged into the river. The annual radioactive effluent reports also contain the calculated radiation dose to the public from the released radioactivity. The calculations consider the amounts of radionuclides released to the air and water, and the breathing, drinking, and food consumption rates for infants, teens, and adults to determine how much radiation exposure each received. The federal limit is 25 millirem per year. The calculated dose was far below that limit. The 2019 results from the previous slide are typical. Between 2005 and 2019, none of the annual radiation doses to the public exceeded a mere fraction of the federal limit. To put the annual radiation doses from Indian Point releases in context, the EPA reports that the radiation emitted from a banana is 5 times higher than the maximum radiation dose from water discharged to the Hudson River between 2005 and 2019. Circling back to the earlier point about risk during decommissioning dropping due to lower energy levels and radioactivity inventories, this data during reactor operation and decommissioning shows that the theory is borne out in practice. The radiation dose to workers decreased once the reactor stopped operating. What can be learned from schools in addition to math, science, geology, music, and other subjects? Following the March 1979 meltdown of 3 Mile Island Unit 2, schools in the area were closed for about 2 weeks. Then they reopened and remained open during the next 10 years it took to clean up the melted core and contaminated buildings. The Zion nuclear plant in Illinois shut down in 1996. Decommissioning was postponed until 2006 and undertaken over the next decade. Decommissioning progressed to empty field, except for the dry cask pad, with several schools in the vicinity. The risk to the public, whether at school, at work, at home, or at play, is lower during decommissioning than during reactor operation because the energy levels and radionuclide inventories are significantly reduced. Despite the lower risk, the federal limits on radiation releases, monitoring, and sampling remain unchanged throughout decommissioning. Thus, the margins to the limits increase over time. The safety net protecting the public during radiation releases remains unchanged during decommissioning, even though the risk of radioactivity releases decreases significantly when an operating reactor permanently shuts down. Thank you.
Thanks. I know Dave pre-recorded that, but thank you again, Dave, for putting that presentation together. For those of you watching right now, in case you didn't miss one of the earlier slides in there, this slide presentation is available on our website, dps.ny.gov/Indian Point. There's a number of resources on there, including a number of other presentations that Dave Rothbaum has assembled to respond to questions of the DOB and some that have emerged from the community on decommissioning. So again, thank you for that, Dave. I believe now with that, we can turn to the public forum.
So in preparation for today's forum, we invited the public to email their questions ahead of time to the NHUD PTA Advocacy Committee. We received a number of submissions. 3 of the 4 PTA unit representatives met last week to review each question. Please note, you will not hear all of the questions exactly as they were written. Similar questions were grouped together and sometimes reworded to avoid duplication and to ensure that they were clear. We also chose to exclude some questions that we felt were either off topic of tonight's forum or too inflammatory, as we would like to see that remain civil and with an eye and an ear toward sharing information, and allowing the public to express their concerns without becoming argumentative and confrontational. The final list of questions was sent to Mr. Kuzmarek last week, so that tonight's speakers could review them and gather the necessary information ahead of time in order to help them answer the questions thoroughly here tonight. We hope you'll find this portion of the forum helpful.
Good evening. My name is Anthony Belcito, and I will be reading the questions out loud. And our panel here will provide answers to them. The first question is, what is the state and specifically the DOB doing to ensure that Holtec follows all precautionary measures, regulations, guidelines, and laws in its work?
I'm Kelly Turturro. I am the regional director for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in the Hudson Valley area. From the New York State DEC perspective, we have several areas of jurisdiction over the facility, including a state pollutant discharge elimination system permit, otherwise known as a SPDIS permit, that covers non-radiological discharges to waters of the state. We also have jurisdiction over petroleum storage at the facility. In that, we are overseeing the closure and assessment of all petroleum tanks. And finally, we have permit jurisdiction for the air permit, which covers boilers and combustion engines that are at the facility. Also, as Tom mentioned in the beginning, there is a DEC consent order that requires Holtec to investigate and remediate contamination on site.
Thanks, Kelly. And just to reiterate some other points that we made earlier, in addition to numerous regulations at the federal and state levels, and in addition to standards and agreements that are in place to reduce the risk profile of Indian Point, there's a number of additional actions that this body has taken to promote greater safety in and around Indian Point. One of the benefits provided by the DOB is that decommissioning activities and government agency oversight activities can be discussed in regular public forums such as this, and issues in need of further attention can be identified. As a result of the DOB and its members and your public engagement, we have a state inspector that was hired and is regularly on site. We have the heavy pipeline crossings MOU that we discussed earlier, and we continue to advocate for appropriate federal emergency planning and systems requirements to remain in place until all spent fuel is out of the spent fuel pools. So that continues. We continue to look for new opportunities that we can promote good practices at Indian Point.
The next question is, what are the current plans for demolition? When and how will these plans be carried out? And specifically, will the domes be imploded?
Holtec, as the site owner, provides updates on its decommissioning schedule at our regular decommissioning oversight board meetings. While demolition activities have been ongoing at the site, Holtec has told us that heavy demolition, which is defined as the demolition of concrete buildings with thick walls, also the spent fuel pool buildings, turbine buildings, and domes, would not occur until the fourth quarter of 2023 at the earliest. And that would be after all spent fuel is transferred to dry cask storage and vessel segmentation within the containment domes underwater and under negative pressure has been completed. We will ask Holtec for a schedule of updates at our future DOB meetings. And just in terms of the question about domes being imploded, there has been no indication that implosion is part of Holtec's plans for demolition.
Thank you. The next question is, has a final decision been made as to timing of heavy demolition blasting? Specifically, will it take place during the school year or can it wait till summer?
We are going to ask Holtec as the DOB to elaborate on their plan schedule, their demolition methods, and their mitigation strategies at an upcoming DOB meeting so that they can more specifically answer this question.
Thank you. And how can the community advocate for tenting during demolition?
So first and foremost, we encourage community members to attend our DOB meetings and participate in the public safety opportunities. Holtec is always at the table during those DOB meetings. Regarding dust mitigation, there are rules and regulations designed to prevent releases of material from the site that are already in place. In addition, the state will monitor decommissioning activities with that important principle in mind. And as mentioned in Dave Lockman's presentation, before any demolition work may begin, the site owner is required to obtain a permit from the Village of Buchanan, which also includes dust mitigation measures. Tom?
Thanks, Kelly. And yeah, just to elaborate this on a bit, we've discussed this a bit at some of our past oversight board meetings. So if you haven't viewed that, I do want to encourage you to check out some of the resources that Dave Lockbaum has assembled. Again, they're available on our website. It's the independent technical expert. There's a little section on the website dedicated to a lot of the research he's done. But he focused on this concept of tenting. And just to clarify, sometimes there's some confusion with what you see as vertical safety netting in downtown Manhattan. The vertical safety netting is when you see that on high-rise structures, it's to protect people and equipment. So it's not dust mitigation, but there is a method considered tenting, which is encompassing a building with physical apparatus. This is the textbook definition, designed to contain particulate and gaseous substances. So there is a method, but as I mentioned before, Dave Lockman kind of went into this a bit more in detail in some of his presentations for us, and identifying some of those dust mitigation methods and procedures that are in place, and the fact that while tenting is a method, it is not the only method of dust mitigation measures. So thank you, Kelly. Yes, we're definitely still looking at this at future DOB meetings, but just a point of education that it is one method, but there are many others out there as well.
Thank you. Next question. Has baseline testing been done at the school, either for both inside and outside, for dust and particulates and gypsum?
So a few aspects to this answer. First, existing monitoring and testing protocols for Indian Point would capture dispersal events emanating from the Indian Point site, including in the direction of Beebe School. And existing notification channels would be utilized if there was or is an imminent threat to the public, including at the Beebe School. The DOB, as Tom mentioned earlier, is taking the additional action of procuring environmental consulting services to develop a community air monitoring plan with the primary focus of fence line monitors around the Indian Point site. The review of the request for proposals is actively proceeding and should be completed soon. And the school monitoring work group, which is part of the decommissioning oversight board, will work with a selected contractor to determine science-based solutions to incorporate the Beebe Elementary School. Importantly, the focus of the Indian Point DOB is on Indian Point and the community as it relates to Indian Point. There could certainly be other sources of dust and particulates which could affect locations in the community. And if there are any concerns about other locations, I would encourage you to contact me at the Department of Environmental Conservation. I'm happy to give you my card after the meeting, and you can reach directly out to me. And then finally, while the monitoring efforts of the DOB don't focus on other potential sources, additional testing or monitoring by the community is also an option that's available to the community.
Thank you, Kelly. Has any testing done to date taken into account the possible existing presence of gypsum or other contaminants?
So Holtec is required to file an annual environmental report with NRC showing the results of all environmental monitoring at the site to show compliance with federal regulations. That link to those reports over the years is available in Dave Lockdown's presentation that he gave this evening.
And when will the public see the school monitoring plan, and when, or will there be an opportunity for the public to comment on it?
We put this plan together based on input from community members, the local school district, local and state elected officials, academic and advisory groups, along with research conducted by New York State agency experts and the Indian Point Decommissioning Oversight Board, independent technical expert, Dave Lockdown. The DOB determined that air monitoring during decommissioning of Indian Point beyond 2023 can provide necessary assurances to the community. As I mentioned earlier, we put out a request for proposals. Was issued on January 9th of this year, seeking environmental consulting services to develop and implement a community air monitoring plan to be in place during the decommissioning of Indian Point. The public's comments and concerns were considered in the development of this community air monitoring plan RFP, and it includes real-time monitoring for VOCs, PM10, and radioactive materials at the Indian Point perimeter. As I mentioned earlier, the review of proposals is actively proceeding and should be complete soon. And once a contractor is selected, we will work to ensure that the community is provided regular updates through the DOB.
Thank you. Will the school monitoring catch the type of contamination, namely cesium-137, that was found on the roof of a building at Holtec's Pilgrim site?
Existing monitoring, sampling, reporting, investigation, equipment and protocols are already in place to detect releases of radioactive materials, including cesium-137. So the RFP issued to establish a community air monitoring plan that Kelly was just talking about would include a requirement for monitoring radioactive materials like cesium-137. Just a sidebar on this discussion about Holtec's Pilgrim site. For those who aren't aware, this is in Plymouth, Massachusetts, so it's not near here. But Dave Lockdown did recently look into the Pilgrim event for the DOB. There's a number of Q&As on our website specifically to that. I certainly encourage you to look at that if you have any other questions or interest about learning about this particular event.
Next question, will the monitoring focus solely on emissions from the plant, or will it be able to detect other sources? And relatedly, when will the school monitoring begin?
So in answer to the first question, the community air monitoring plan will monitor activities related to the decommissioning of Indian Point. And as far as when it will begin, there is ongoing monitoring already occurring on site and off site that was in place when the plant was operational and continues to be in place today. Additional monitoring is being developed for the community, is projected to begin in late 2023 or early 2024 after baseline assessments are completed and based on current schedule projections by Holtec in advance of heavy demolition work at the Indian Point site.
Will the school district and the community have real-time access to the reports of the air monitors at PD?
The RFP requires that the consultant provide at a minimum weekly reports to the local and state agencies. The DOB and the school monitoring working group will work with the consultant who's chosen to determine the science-based solutions that will incorporate the baby school.
Are there any laws in place or official guidelines to protect the area from industrial pollution?
So in terms of general pollution, there are local, state, and federal regulations in place. At the local level, as I mentioned before, demolition permits require dust mitigation. At the state level, there are various environmental regulations prohibiting pollution, and there are permits in place that govern discharges from the facility. And at the federal level, Holtec must file an annual environmental report with NRC showing the results of environmental monitoring at the site to show compliance with relevant federal regulations.
Thank you. If there is contamination, who will pay for the cleanup?
So Holtec is responsible for all costs associated with complete and comprehensive decommissioning and site restoration of Indian Point. In addition to the radiological decommissioning process under the jurisdiction of the NRC, Holtec must also comply with the terms of a DEC consent order requiring investigation and remediation of non-radiological contamination. And let me just point out here again that one of the protections that New York State and the parties were able to advocate for in the transfer agreement was a number of financial protections that will ensure that there is enough for full and complete cleanup and restoration. Thank you.
Who makes up the school monitoring working group?
I think that's me again. So the monitoring working group, you see a subset here actually, but it was established immediately following the creation of the DOB. And actually thanks to the advocacy of a number of parents in the community and the superintendent of the school district. While the working group is comprised of DOB members, it's intended to be a subset of the DOB. The group included the superintendent who regularly received, considered, and incorporated input from parents and their surrogates in determining science-based solutions to incorporate the PV school, and the health and safety considerations of its student body in any monitoring plan.
Thank you. How will the public be informed if there is an incident at the plant and or in the surrounding area, such as at BB?
Hi, Susan Spear from the Westchester County Department of Emergency Services. I want to thank everybody for their interest in these very important issues to the community. So in terms of Westchester County's emergency planning and preparedness, nothing has changed right now since decommissioning started from what we did through all our emergency planning and preparedness while the plant is operating. So all of the activities that we have been doing over the years that the plant is operating, we are still doing right now. In terms of the actual notifications, also, nothing has changed. The sirens are still in place. All of the notification systems that we have are still in place. And essentially what would happen if there was an emergency, the notifications that you would receive would really depend on the type of emergency that was unfolding. So it could start with the sirens. If there was a radiological emergency, it could start with an outbound 911 call. If an evacuation was necessary, there could be a knock at your door. So bottom line, nothing's changed. Everything that Westchester County was doing in terms of emergency planning is still in place.
Thank you. What are all available options for disposal of the tritium in the spent fuels?
Actually, I want to see if Dave Lockbaum is with us. Dave, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. I can address that. I addressed the four options during the February 2nd, 2023 DOB meeting. What I looked at was filter and release to the river, as has been done for decades at Indian Point. The second option I looked at was used at 3 Mile Island after its 1979 reactor accident. Due to mostly state and local requirements, they weren't allowed to release that water to the Susquehanna River. So instead, they filtered and evaporated it to the air. They basically boiled it off to the air rather than release it to the river. The third option I looked at was one that's being contemplated for the Vermont Yankee nuclear plant in Vermont, and that is to filter the water and then transport it as liquid off-site for burial in Idaho. Approximately 2 million gallons of contaminated water is slated for that process. And the fourth option I looked at was the one being used at the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan following its March 2011 accident where 3 reactors were melted down. They've built dozens, if not hundreds, of storage tanks to handle or hold the water until they can come up with a way to filter it and then ultimately release it into the Pacific Ocean. So those were the 4 options I looked at. All 4 of them would meet federal regulation or federal limits. In my opinion, the one that provided the least harm to the public or least risk to the public was the first one, the filter and release to the river.
Thank you. How much water does Holtec plan to discharge into the Hudson River at any one time?
This is Dave Lockbaum again. I looked at their 2021 annual report, which is similar to what they've been doing in recent years. There, they released 104 batch releases of radioactively contaminated water. It was 100 batch releases from Unit 3 and 4 batch releases from Unit 2. Based on the numbers and some math, it looks like the average batch release was about 17,580 gallons. And I didn't multiply that together to see what the overall total was, but it was a lot of water.
Thank you. What monitoring will there be or is already in place to detect the amounts of and exactly what is in the discharged water?
A document called the Offsite Dose Calculation Manual, ODCM, which is attached to the 2021 annual effluent report, specifies the process that must be followed before release to the river occurs. Holtec will cause the tank to be released to be recirculated for at least 3 tank volumes to get uniform mixture of the water inside that tank. Then they'll draw a sample from that tank to determine the radioactive concentrations of isotopes in the water. And then multiplying how much water and what the radioactive inventory is, they'll determine how much of each radionuclide went out. And they'll include that and they'll roll those numbers up into the annual report of how much cesium, how much strontium, how much tritium was discharged to the river. One last comment about that sampling process and the determination of what's in the water. That sampling results are then used also to set the set point for the radiation detector in the discharge line. And if the amount of radioactivity exceeds that set point, if there's a surprise or they didn't uniformly sample the tank or whatever, that radiation detector will detect that and cause the release to the river to be terminated.
So I'll just jump in here as well. Dave talked about the radiological discharges that are governed by under the auspices of the federal government. New York State DEC, as I mentioned earlier, also has a discharge permit that governs the non-radiological discharges from the facility. So in terms of sampling and requirements for reporting to DEC, Holtec is required to sample at various frequencies and submit those results to DEC on a monthly basis through what we call discharge monitoring reports. DEC reviews that data to ensure compliance with the limits that are set in our CD's permit that are under DEC's jurisdiction.
Thanks. And the New York State Department of Health has 3 sampling locations in the immediate area, one near the inlet, one near Roseton, one downstream. And those are sampled monthly and that's available on full data. Scanning those results.
And actually, let me know, it is on Open Data, which is a website on New York. We've actually also provided quick links to that on the DOE website, and just be a one-stop shop. So you can also access it there.
Thank you. What is the DOB doing to identify other contamination besides tritium in the spent fuel pool water?
Well, this is Dave Lockbaum. I've done a couple of things. One is to look at the annual effluent reports, which includes a table that lists each radionuclide that was in the water released to the river. As a check or a backstop on those reports, I've also looked at the annual radiological environmental reports, which show the results from the sampling of water, soil, vegetation, etc. So if the amounts going out in the river were wrong or misstated or calculated wrong or whatever, the sampling results would catch that eventually as that higher than expected radioactivity showed up in the soil, water, whatever. And what the data shows that there's been no bioaccumulation or concentration of the released amounts, and the peak releases, most of the releases going to the river are tritium. The filtering that's done is pretty successful at removing strontium, cesium, nickel, and cobalt and the other radionuclides, but it's not really good at removing tritium. So tritium constitutes more than 99% of the radioactivity going out to the river.
And from the non-radiological perspective, Tex Speedies permit is undergoing a renewal process before DEC right now. We are undertaking a full technical review of the permit to ensure that those limits that are contained in the Speedies permit reflect current operations at the facility.
Thank you. What is the state's and the DOB's position on Voltec's plan to discharge water from the spent fuel pools into the Hudson? If the state does not support Voltec's dumping of water into the Hudson, what measures are you taking to prevent it from happening?
Thanks, Tony. So while radiological discharges are governed under the auspices of the federal government, we nonetheless, as the DOB, we serve as that important body to garner feedback about and provide information on matters related to decommissioning, including this. And that's actually why, for that very reason, the treatment and removal of water in the Indian Point spent fuel pools is an issue that we're actively reviewing, and in fact, we're providing a forum to ensure transparency about the resolution, the ultimate resolution of that matter. We're actually inviting relevant federal agencies to report to the community at a future meeting of the DOB to make sure that we're able to get resolution on that.
Question, what safety measures do you support to ensure that negative environmental, health, and other impacts will be minimized? Should recreational uses like swimming or boating in the Hudson be curtailed around the time of discharge?
Dave, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. One of the things, as I pointed out earlier, the amount of tritium that's going out to the river, and tritium is the major component of the releases, is well below the federal limits. That calculation is also done very conservatively by Entergy and now Holtec. The calculations looking at how much radioactivity is in the tank or that's being discharged, mixed with a dilution flow of now at least 80,000 gallons per minute of water drawn from the river that mixes with the tank being discharged, or the tank being discharged is put into that 80,000 gallons and goes out to the river. Federal law allows them to take credit for the dilution by the river, which is a much larger volume. But Holtec and Entergy did not take credit for that allowance. They very conservatively assumed just a lower dilution flow. And they're still not anywhere close to the federal limits on tritium going out there. It's like one slide I used, whereas even if you halved cut the federal limit in half and increase the amount of radioactivity in the water by a factor of 10, you'd still have margin to the permitted limit. So it's there's so much margin available that I don't think any additional precautions or restrictions during swimming, boating, et cetera, would have any value.
Dave, you're talking about significant margins, and I recall a slide earlier on what those margins are. Can you speak briefly again about what types of margins we'd be talking about at the discharge point?
Yeah, at the discharge point, the amount of tritium that's going into the river is like less than 1% of the federal limit. So there's considerable margin available. Again, even if you assume the federal limit is non-conservatively high, you cut it in half and there's still margin to that. So, and the other thing that supports that, as I mentioned earlier, was the annual radioactive environmental reports, the sampling that's done of the soil, the water in the river, fish in the river, et cetera, is not showing an accumulation of tritium or other radionuclides from the releases from Indian Point. So there's no natural background. In fact, natural background constitutes 89% of the dose to the public around Indian Point, not the tritium going to the river. The tritium going to the river is 3.3% of the overall dose to the public. The natural background is 89%. So it is a concern, but not a major, not even a minor concern.
Thank you. How will the public be informed of any discharges of the spent fuel pool waters into the Hudson and protective measures that they should take?
So I can start with this one. So at each meeting of the DOE, we ask Holtec to provide updates on scheduled activities, including controlled discharges, and that's something that we're going to hold them to. In addition, at the February 2, 2023 meeting, which is the documents and video are available online, Holtec committed to provide 1 month's notice prior to planned discharges of treated water from the spent fuel pools. And again, we're going to keep them at that. Dave, I don't know if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to add to that was the emergency plan that Holtec submitted to the NRC in May of 2021 specifies certain triggers that would require them to notify the state, local authorities, and the NRC of a problem. Some of those include releases to the air and water of radioactivity. And I forget the exact thresholds or the exact triggers, but it's something like if it's the amount going out is twice what they calculated it would be, even though that's not a lethal or harmful level, the fact that it was higher than they anticipated has to be reported fairly promptly to local, state, and federal authorities. I plan to go through and more define what those triggers are a little bit more fully and provide that to the DPS in the future.
Thank you. What is the recommendation related to the Buchanan Burpland Elementary School remaining open and operational?
So based on what we know about the commission today at Indian Point, there's no evidence that there would be a need to close the school based on any health related data. State and the health department recognize there's certainly a lot of concerns about the decommissioning. I looked at Dave Lockman's earlier presentations. We see that the risk at this point is a lot lower than it has ever been in the past when it was operating.
Could you talk into the mic?
Sure, I'm sorry. So based on what we know about the decommissioning at Indian Point, there's no evidence to date that there is a need to close the school, okay? And based on the earlier presentations from Dave Lockbaum, you can see that the risk level at this point is much, much lower than when it was in operation. Thank you.
Thank you. On what is this decision being based, i.e. medical advice, health experts, or demolition experts?
Okay, so again, just to clarify, DOH is not making a recommendation to close the school. The data from the environmental monitoring is reviewed by state agency staff with specialized education, years of experience in the appropriate sciences. And that includes radiobiology, physics, chemistry, air monitoring. So these public health recommendations will be made based on health effects. And based on everything we know at this point, and decommissioning of other power plants, and the health effects of these, of exposure to these contaminants. At the levels we're seeing, we expect the community, to not have to take any additional actions.
And who makes the decision as to whether the school will be closed? Can the state force the district to close it?
And so again, I'll go back to, there's no indication that the school would need to take any action as a result of the decommissioning of the unit. If that information changes, the involved state agencies would make a recommendation to the school board and or the state education regarding, whatever concerns are of the particulars of that health exposure. Right? And then typically the school board, the locality will have a large say in what happens then. Thank you.
And I think the final question, are there studies that show the impact on a building and community located in close proximity to a nuclear plant undergoing demolition?
So as noted in Dave's presentation earlier, he cited several examples toward the end in which a nuclear decommissioning was completed with schools in the immediate vicinity. I don't believe there was any such example that resulted in documented negative impacts to those schools as a result of decommissioning, but Dave, if you found something else in your research, I'd welcome.
Yeah, to add to Tom's comment there, the other thing I did was look at past decommissionings at Maine Yankee, Connecticut Yankee, Big Rock Point, Humboldt Bay, Zion, Trojan, Rancho Seco, to see if there are any surprises that could pose a harm to this community. There were some mistakes made, and the good news is those mistakes were made elsewhere, and the lessons learned have been factored into how Holtec is doing things at Indian Point. But there was no event I discovered at any of those plants that posed a risk to the communities nearby.
Thank you. So that's all the pre-submitted questions that we had. It's my understanding now we're going to go to live questions. Do we have a list of people who? Okay. Okay. Teresa Sings.
Okay, she just wants to read the email list. I'm sorry. Okay, I thought you were signing up to. Okay, so
How do we sign up to speak?
yeah, there was a sign up sheet with Jess, but it's been always. Anyone would like to sign up for this? Let's make sure that we get it.
And the next thing on the list here is Chad Andruso. Andruso, and please correct my almost guaranteed to be mispronunciation of his name.
Good evening. My name is Chad Andrusik. I'm the parent of 2 young kids in this district. And I'm trying to catch up with everything. There's a lot going on, absolutely. But I guess my question right now is for DC. There's a remedial investigation scoping work plan that was completed at, I think, July 2022. It outlines the different periods for decommissioning. Period 1 is pre-decommissioning planning and preparation. Period 2, plant deactivation, and so on. Where are we at currently in this stage?
Thanks for the question, Chad. So as Holtec, let me take a step back. There are certain areas of the site that are designated different areas that Holtec will approach as a phased approach. They are beginning with an area that they term as the Lafarge area. So it's essentially off-site, but still part of the whole tech site. So what they have done is end of January, I believe it was January 31st, they submitted a draft work plan to DEC to remediate that area. We are currently, DEC is currently reviewing that work plan and will determine whether or not we have comments on it, or whether or not it is approved for remediation. So we're at the very beginning of the process now, is really the short answer to your question, looking at that first area.
And I know obviously NRC covers the radiological elements, the decommissioning, and DC is covering whatever is sort of left with this consent agreement. This does reference DR 38, and basically the requirements for identifying radiological elements in the soil. Is that being applied to this investigation?
Yes,
Well, okay, so
It is.
it would address low levels of radiation in the soil.
yes, the consent order requires, and I think I need Dan Evans for the number. Thank you. It is 10 millirem for Holtec to clean up to this under the consent order.
Okay, so Holtec is responsible for identifying any sort of radiological hot spots within the entire vicinity, right? Okay, and then whatever is left is DC's responsibility. It's covered by the species permit and whatever else is left for remediation. Right? So my concern is if there's any low levels of radiation that's not identified in the soil that could become fugitive dust emissions that maybe isn't being identified before it's dust in the air, essentially, or runoff from a storm.
So the federal requirements in regulation requires cleanup to a 25 millirem standard. Under the DEC consent order that we negotiated with Holtec, Holtec needs to clean up to a 10 millirem standard. So more stringent than the federal regulations, but that is the governing standard that Holtec will clean up to.
This is David Lockbaum. Can I add to that response?
Yes, please do, David.
Okay, one of the last steps in the decommissioning process is for the owner to apply to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for a final site release, which basically means decommissioning is over, except for the dry casks that may still be on site. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission brings in scientists from Oak Ridge National Lab to independently survey the soil and the surroundings. So they don't just take, in this case, Holtec's word for it. The Oak Ridge group will come in and independently survey the soil to see that the cleanup does meet the standard. And that provides some assurance that it, companies, you can trust the company, but there is a backstop to that just to be sure.
Thank you. And I guess I have one last question, David. It's kind of a little, it's more so for the decommissioning of the reactors. As I understand it, it's sort of an inside out approach. They go and basically disassemble all the primary components first and get rid of the elements that have high radiation. What's left, I guess, is a whole lot of sort of concrete. The concrete that's left, I'm assuming it has to be characterized for radiation, right, prior to demolition.
Yeah, this is Dave Lockbaum. That's correct. One of the first steps, I mentioned one of the last steps in decommissioning. One of the first steps in decommissioning is to do a survey of the building components and the surrounding soils to identify what radiological and non-radiological hazards are there, which then that survey then informs the decision about how to do that process. So they, and that's one of the things the NRC does check to make sure that surveys are right, because that's protecting the workers first and the public also. So that's done, and that again, it informs how the remaining removal and demolition and so on is done.
Thank you.
Chris Dango, did you want to ask a question?
First who?
Barbara.
Fargo. Fargo. Again, I apologize for mispronunciation.
Mr. Director, there's one representative for the EPA on site. That does the oversight. Here. So all that information comes from Holtec.
Yeah.
Now, in other words, who monitors the monitors?
On site, so EPA is on site.
I must ask a good question because nobody wants to answer it.
No, that is, that's not the case. We are all happy to answer the question. Just want to make sure, giving you the comprehensive, response here. First of all, as, Tom Kasmerick said, New York State arranged to have a on-site monitor. That person came on board, last year, 2022. And is on site and reports to our colleagues up in Albany, in DPS and also on the decommissioning oversight board. So there is a monitor there. There are also from time to time NRC monitors who come on occasion to inspect the site. Certain aspects of the construction work or the deconstruction work that is ongoing. There is also, as Kelly Totoro mentioned, there is a consent order between Holtec and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation addressing residual radiation issues and other pollutants and contaminants. And that process is being developed, but that will have DEC oversight as well. I don't want to speak out of turn for Kelly, so I'm going to hand it to her. But there actually are monitors at the site. Kelly.
John is right in terms of the consent order, but I just wanted to also add that in terms of our permit jurisdiction that I talked about earlier, our staff conducts regular inspections. So we have a variety of engineers from our water division, our air division, and our petroleum division that are on site doing inspections to ensure that there's compliance with the permit or compliance with the closure requirements.
No radiological monitors from the state.
So actually, as we discussed before, there are actually a number of levels of monitoring from the federal government, from the state that do focus on a number of the matters that we're talking about right now. I'm hoping Dave, I know there's, I think I hear a question here about how do we know what the company is saying is true? Is that part of your question?
Exactly.
Because there's some monitoring there. Dave, I know you know quite a bit about this. I don't know if you'd be willing to comment on some of the checks that are in place to kind of confirm what Holtec's monitoring looks like.
Yeah, a couple of points. One was there's a material I provided last year that's posted on that section of the DPS website, DOB's website. It's called Ensuring Nuclear Safety During Decommissioning. One of the things that I was surprised to learn during my July 2022 tour of the plant, that the American Nuclear Insurers had been in the previous week. The American Nuclear Insurers underwrites insurance for Indian Point. If the decommissioning fund comes up empty, American Nuclear Insurers may have to pay out the shortfall. They don't like doing that. So the American Nuclear Insurers are in, they've got money vested on this, on making sure Holtec does it right, because they don't want to pay out any premiums or anything. So I was reminded of that during that July 2022 tour. In addition to something that Kelly said about the NRC being there periodically, or was said earlier, the NRC is there periodically, and it's not just random when they have a spare week. They look at the decommissioning schedule, and send out inspectors before Holtec undertakes something that might be at risk. So that it was discussed earlier about the cesium-137 found on the roof at Pilgrim. That was found by NRC inspectors who were looking because that building was scheduled for demolition, and the NRC wanted to make sure there were no surprises. So the NRC's inspections are periodic, but they're tailored to what's going on at the site to ensure they get, so the NRC gets the best in return on its investment of time and resources.
And this is John Seckers. There was just one other aspect I wanted to raise on this. I believe as Kelly and Tom have mentioned, the Village of Buchanan has a framework, has a program for demolition permits. And they have a building permit department, so there was also a tie-in and an avenue pathway for village inspector to be involved as well.
I don't want to all night. Clearwater was good enough to put an informational form on, and they said the woman from Salem, Massachusetts, stated that Holtec lied, that submitted false paperwork about the readings. Do you know, can you speak to that? Is that true or not?
So we would need more specific information on that. Saying someone lied is not actionable. So if there's, if you'd like to provide specific citations to documentations where it is alleged, we would be certainly interested in looking at that. But you would want to vet it in independently verify any such statement.
That's very fair. But it was mentioned that in a previous forum. I'm surprised you guys didn't hear it. But I just wanted to put that there. There's two things, again, I apologize, David, so much time. Mr. Lockbaum failed to mention that there is a way to filter tritium, but it's too expensive. That's what he said at the February 22nd meeting at the town court hall. And also, he said that the NRC felt it was too expensive to studies around decommissioning plants. I think it was at a cost of $1 million a year to increase the cancer rates.
So Dave, do you wish to respond to that? I believe I recall what you were speaking about, but you may be able to handle that directly.
Yeah, with regard to filtering of tritium, Canada and I believe Japan do have systems to remove tritium. I know the United Kingdom, Britain does this too. It's very expensive, and they use the tritium they extract for tritium exit signs. So it doesn't make it go away, it just changes it into a different form that they have a use for tritium exit signs. As far as the NRC study, it was $1 million a year for 8 years, and it was mainly aimed at operating plants, but I guess they could have thrown in some decommissioning sites as well. But NRC determined that cost too much, so they did not do the study.
Okay, thank you very much.
And just to clarify, and to reiterate what Dave said, it was about operating plans, that discussion back in February.
Is there a Warren Smith?
How are you doing? Thanks very much for putting this on, this PTA, and putting this together. I'm Warren Smith. I'm president of the Brookline Residents Association. Actually, at the form of that stage, not 100 years ago, and I was one of the first classes in the school. So I gotta say first that I personally wasn't aware. The first plant opened 2 years before I was born, but I was never aware that they were actually releasing tritium into the Hudson. And I was surprised when I asked the riverkeeper, a riverkeeper call, how many years? They said 61 years they've been doing it. So, and thanks very much, Dave, for telling us about how much and what the batches are. I just was kind of wondering, so they've been doing this all these years. Was it a constant release, or is it something that's you know, 104 batches is I'm not quite sure I understand the process. We were always taught, actually in the school, that radioactivity just wasn't released ever, that there was water coming out into the Hudson, into the reactor to cool the steam water, but not, it never touched anything radioactive normally in the Hudson. So can you just, is there any way you can describe what the, how they cool the rods off? You were saying 80,000 gallons a minute, is that just constantly going in and out or going into?
Yeah, this is Dave Lockbaum. The system that's cooling the spent fuel pools takes water from the spent fuel pool, sends it through a heat exchanger where water from the river on the other side of the tubes in heat exchanger cools that water down. The cooled spent fuel pool water is returned to the spent fuel pool, just recycled over and over. The slightly warmer river water is returned to the river. Periodic, when the plant was operating, there were certain systems that would release small amounts of radioactivity into that return flow to the river. With the plant no longer operating, that's not happening anymore. What happens instead is, for example, there's also a system that the water drawn from the spent fuel pool goes through filters and demineralizers to keep the spent fuel pool water as clean as possible, mainly for protection of the workers, but also to protect the spent fuel rods from rusting. So that periodically those filters and those demineralizers need to be backwashed because they get depleted. Well, that water is collected in a liquid radway system tanks that periodically fill up to create volume for additional future backwashes and so on. The tanks are I said they were recirculated for at least 3 tank volumes, sampled, and if the results are low enough, the tank is discharged to the river. Those were the 104 batch releases that occurred from Unit 2 and Unit 3 last year. But the continuous releases were occurring when the reactors were operating. They're pretty much not happening like they were because of the changed plant status.
I see. So when I read the paper that they're going to release 1 million gallons in August, I had looked after hearing from the people that it's been a constant thing. I went onto the NRC site and I saw they have all PDFs of all the releases, and it looked like they report by the quarter. So when they start to release it in August, that would mean that they'll start in August and they'll finish when.
Well, they probably won't discharge directly from the spent fuel pool to the river. They'll drain or they'll move water from the spent fuel pool into those liquid red waste collection tanks and filter it to the extent they can to minimize everything but the tritium that's in it. And then that filtered water will then be released on a batch basis to the river. So it won't be a continuous discharge of spent fuel pool water to the river. It will be done in batches. And the 1 million gallons is not just the spent fuel pool water. There's a couple other tanks at the site that are contributing to that overall million gallon total.
And I think on the IPAC meeting, you had mentioned the second, I didn't quite get it. There was the release to the Hudson. I forget how much you were saying was going to expose us through the tritium, but I think the evaporation was, I want to say, did you say 100 times more?
No, the 3 Mile Island situation where they did evaporate the accident generated water, there was a study done by an academic group that said that the dose to the public from evaporation was 3 to 4 times higher than just discharging it to the Susquehanna River had that been permitted. And it's the amount of tritium that went out is basically the same, whether you evaporate it or discharge it to the river. But that released radioactivity, how it gets inhaled or consumed by the humans living around the plant changes. And Harrisburg had a lot of agricultural dairy farms, et cetera, around the plant where the tritium released to the air would fall back down to the ground by rainfall and still be consumed by humans. And less of it would have been consumed by humans if it went into the river and went on its way to Philadelphia.
And just, I'll give up the mic for a sec. Just one last question was, if we did something like take it and put it into, it sounds like we would break up the water and then ship it to Idaho. How long would something like that take? And I'm not worried about the cost, I'm just wondering how long will we be exposed to this? Right now, every time I drive by the plant, I guess for the last zillion years, 60 years, there's some type of exposure, get put it in tanks and store it. I read someplace that there's a release just in the process of storing it. Is that true?
It's true in that most storage tanks are vented, so to keep them from imploding or exploding if you fill them up too much. So tritiated water evaporates and goes out through the vent. In addition, the tanks at Fukushima that were built to store the water from that damaged reactor leaked within 30 months. Tanks are notorious leakers. It's not so much the tanks themselves, it's the connections, the pipes that go to them. And the event that happened last year at Indian Point where the level instrumentation failed and they put too much water into a tank because it wasn't big enough. That happens all the time. So tanks are not long-term solutions. They're just different versions of the problem. I think that's why I think filtering and releasing the water of the river is the surest way of minimizing dose to the public.
I promised to go with Mike, but one other question for Matthias. In the past, I've read that there had been some type of a leak in one of the reactors. I don't know if it was reactor 1, strontium. I know there's wells all around to measure that. Is that still an ongoing thing now that the plant's shut down? Or will that clear up eventually?
Well, the primary leak was started from the Unit 1 spent fuel pool, and that led to the putting in a lot of monitoring wells around the site. Because of the leak from Unit 1, the spent fuel pool water from Unit 1 was discharged to the river in 2008. So that pool is now empty, and there's nothing else that can be leaked out from an empty pool. There was additional leakage found from the Unit 2 spent fuel pool that was pretty much mitigated. There's still some of the leaked water from both Unit 1 and Unit 2 are still finding their way to the river through groundwater plumes that are being monitored by the wells. But the storing the water long-term in the spent fuel pools is again a risk that at some point it may start leaking out. And since it's below ground, you don't know about it until it shows up in a well.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
So actually, I want to just follow up on some of your observations, if I could, Mr. Smith. I actually really appreciate your historical perspective that you have shared with us here tonight. Given your long-term time here and what you heard and what you were taught, over time. So I just want to come back to a point that I think Dave Lockbaum made, but I think others here have made as well. We have looked at the historical reports of liquid discharges, and to be sure, there were discharges going on over time. And we have looked at what Dave Lockbaum has collected, in which he showed on, I think, his chart that he had in his earlier presentation here. And as Dave has observed, those historical reports, they're all in with the NRC, confirm that the historical discharges have amounted to only a very small fraction of the applicable regulatory limits with respect to treatment. Very small fraction. And I know Paul Blanche has made public comments, and he has been attending our oversight board meetings over time. And we have agreement with Paul Blanche's observation regarding the relative risks, and Paul's observation that it would be useful to verify and characterize future releases to ensure that any remaining releases, and we are at the tail end of those releases, that those releases comply with regulatory standards. Last year, Richard Webster and Riverkeeper suggested checking and comparing the release data to see if they were below what the United States Environmental Protection Agency has as a maximum contaminant level for drinking water. That was what Richard suggested, I think it was last July. And consistent with, Mr. Webster's suggestion, the historical record here reflects that those historical releases at the point of discharge are very far below the regulatory limits set by the EPA for drinking water. So with that, factual basis, going forward, I think we would want to ensure, as I think, some commenters have recommended, that future discharges reflect similar trends to what has happened in the past. And with that in mind, it makes sense to, confirm and verify that future releases are consistent with the past discharges. So, we're going to be exploring that. And I really appreciate your perspective. And I think, it's very helpful to have that added to the record and for us to hear it. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I used to canoe and up and down the Hudson and ship my friends from out of town, that we were dealing on, but build paths, don't worry, this canoe would get warm actually as you go up towards the plant. I never realized I really maybe should have had some, but
The levels were.
Oh, I understand. I'm totally, I get it. So, but one other thing is, did our state representatives and our local representatives, were they apprised of this releases, or is it something that wasn't, I mean, that from what I'm reading, that's how a reactor works. That
Yes.
There's no every reactor.
Under the auspices of the federal agency.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm told that we have a hard stop at 9 o'clock. I do have 4 more people interested in asking questions, so I'll just ask that you try to police yourselves in consideration of the people who would like to go after you. But next we have Courtney Williams.
Sorry, are you calling me?
Yes.
Thank you. So we kept talking about air monitoring. Are you only monitoring the air?
I mean, under the community air monitoring plan?
Well, I mean, we have the school monitoring working group. Is the plan only to monitor air? There'll be no dust or soil testing around the school or in the school?
So the RFP that we put out for the community air monitoring plan through the school monitoring working group was to conduct air monitoring. So we looked at 2 aspects really. First is radiological aspects, and then the other side of it was for VOC's PM10.
You don't need to rehash it. I was just like, why not look at dust, right? So we've got 2 other schools in the US that have been closed because they've been contaminated. Those were not, that contamination was not found from air monitoring. So why are we only monitoring the air and not dust and testing the school?
So we can certainly talk to the consultant once a consultant is on board to see if that's something that is a possibility.
I mean, but why, so you talked about who was on the working group, but who wasn't on the working group was a parent from this school or a person from this community. I'm not an expert in environmental monitoring, but I can read the news and see, the NRC found that cesium-137. I'm sure they have air monitors at Pilgrim. Why didn't they pick up that? Right? Like if air monitoring was the sole need, then it would have known about that cesium and it wouldn't have taken the NRC testing, right?
So we'll take your comment under consideration.
Okay, I believe I made that comment as community input. However, you all were collecting that for the school monitoring working group. But I mean, was anybody in this room solicited for input on the school monitoring? No, no one was. And is there a medical expert on the school monitoring working group, the health expert?
I'm gonna turn this back to Alex in a moment here, but as you're certainly aware, we've been soliciting comments through the DOB about this and many other matters. And also, you know, we were working with the superintendent at the time to.
Well, he's not here now, right? So.
But there's been ample opportunity, and we're, as Kelly said, once we have a consultant selected, then there can be some other discussion with that. But I believe you had a follow-up question about some of the health experts.
Thank you for that question. With respect to looking at the environmental data, it's going to start with scientific assessment of it. And it turns out that, okay, there is a potential, I'm sorry. I'm trying to not spit in the microphone, so keep it a little away. So if there is an assessment that says, okay, we're getting some elevated readings, that's where we would bring in help bring in the commissioner.
So wait until there is radiation spreading to bring in health expert?
Wait until there is some data that suggests that there is a health concern. We bring in a physician when we are assessing a sort of a patient or a clinical situation. Scientists who have expertise in health science but are not physicians will be making those assessments as to, is there a health determination? And is there something?
And do you feel in this case that historical data is a good metric for future exposures? Here?
Well, the historical data we have comes from the operations period, right? Not during the decommissioning. But we see also that during the operations period is when there's the highest risk, there's the most potential for contamination of radiological concern. So we think that's a reasonably good indication of what we may see on the radiological side, yes.
So we don't have to worry about dust. There was a question about imploding the building. You said there was no indication that they were gonna use that. How are they taking the building down then?
Well, and that's something that we're going to ask Holtec to be more specific about at one of our next DOB meetings.
And what about all the contaminated soil at Indian Point? What's happening with all of that? They've been leaking water, the test wells, et cetera.
That's covered under the DEC consent order, where they need to remediate the site under the DEC consent order.
And is there any concern by the Department of Health that all the construction and demolition activities are going to be stirring up all of that contaminated soil?
At this point, the general recirculation of contaminated radiological material in the ground isn't something that we expect to be a concern. But that's where the community air monitoring program would let us know if something's coming off site. On site, there's individual monitoring on the workers as well.
So there's been no testing of PB at all, Dr. Laura. So maybe, and they have no intent, or it seems like dust didn't occur to any of the experts on the working group. So maybe we want to, as a school district, do some of that ourselves. Let's see. Can we get a copy of the script that all the answers that you all read? Is that a transcript script available to us?
Yeah, so a lot of this is to make sure, you know, we know in past meetings that if we've had information to communicate, but due to rushing or whatnot, have not been able to. So sometimes we have notes to confirm we're getting all the information out. A lot of these are already captured in the Q&A on the website, but if there's anything not, I can certainly incorporate that.
And then what things, so there was a lot of questions about the discharge and what's in there, et cetera. What things do you actually look for? And does your testing method find things that you might not be intentionally looking for?
In terms of the DEC speedies permit, you're asking?
Or any of the releases from Indian Point in terms of water, what things were tested for? Like, because we're hearing, you know, like what's is in there or what's not, but presumably if you're not looking for it, you're not gonna find it. So my question is, what was specifically tested for?
So I'd have to get back to you specifically on that answer, and I'm certainly happy to follow up, and I know that we're planning another meeting, so, but if you don't mind, I'll add that question. We'll have our water experts in the room, and I can certainly answer that question for you. But in terms of DEC jurisdiction, there are certain parameters in our speedies permit. And those are the things that we regulate, from the facility. And it mirrors the, DEC regulations, our water regulations and what we regulate from any facility.
For the.
Just quickly, I apologize. I'm seeing a few additional names on here. If it's all right with you.
I'm almost done.
Well, if I have an offer here for you, we'd like to afford everyone the opportunity to speak. If there's time at the end, I'll certainly give it back to you, Deborah.
Okay.
We just want to make sure everyone who had a question actually has an opportunity.
Thank you. Nick Bucci or Bucci?
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I didn't intend to ask a question, but then a couple things came up. My first question is maybe it's a different type of scope, it's not as nitty gritty. To set up my second question, I'll try to be quick. Is it fair to say that the decommissioning of the power plant doesn't leave our grid or electrical power supply or our availability to like reasonably priced electrical energy? Like, will we have any issues with that moving forward in this area? Yes or no? Hopefully, like, no, that we haven't, because that's like one of my main concerns. It's not whether or not, it's not like a lot of the nitty gritty stuff. So I'm just curious about that broad strokes.
Right, if I understand your question correctly, it is, did the closure affect the grid? And there are reports which we have made available at private previous meetings, and the answer is no.
Great. So that's cool. And I think then like closing the plant is something that we could all celebrate generally because I think that would be like a great way to talk about it and think about it. I think we should be able to get to that place as a public. So then my only other question is like, it seems complex, closing a nuclear power plant, decommissioning it. There's all this interesting science and engineering that has to go on. My background is civil engineering. So I have some familiarity with little bits of it. Things like dust control, sometimes they're charmingly simple, like you spray it with a fire hose before you demolish it, and then there's no dust. There's interesting opportunities, I think, to educate the public on why things can and will go well. And I just feel like there's the only thing that leaves, there's a little bit of a vacuum is like public relations kind of. Do you guys find Holtec to be candid, transparent with you? And I'm curious, like, would Holtec people be at a meeting like this in the future? I feel like that would really help the public just feel comfortable with the whole thing and allow us to celebrate it rather than get bogged down in details that might not even be an issue.
So very good question. And if you're new to the process, just so you're aware, at every DOB meeting, we invite Holtec not only to attend, but oftentimes we're actually asking them to be sitting at the table to field questions from the DOB, from elected representatives of yours, from the regulators that are sitting at this table and are listening in right now. So there is that opportunity. And again, our job is to ensure a safe and effective and timely decommissioning and site restoration for this community. And we all come to the table.
That's Holtec's job, right? I'm just saying. That's Holtec's, that's what Holtec's doing.
It is, but
You guys are the
just
ones
like,
that disseminate the information about the process, more or less, and regulate it and check in on it.
and again, we provide additional checks on that process. If you want to think of the regulator as someone who's checking in to make sure that everything's actually going as portfolio is, right? So that is what we do in our day jobs, as well as in this additional above and beyond body that you have before you right now. And again, on April 27th, our next meeting, we're really looking not only to share what we're doing in the NOLA process and the PDC, the Department of Health, Department of Public Service, Westchester County, and the list goes on. It's really just to ensure that we're keeping the company responsible for decommissioning this site, keeping their feet to the fire.
Gotcha. I appreciate the work you're doing, and this was a great informative hearing, so thanks for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Next is Therese Sinks.
You asked me to come in, it's actually Therese, but that's okay, I just wanted to set the record straight. I have lots of notes here. One thing I would like to reiterate regarding the school monitoring working group. I do think it's imperative to have a parent on that group, as part of that group. I understand that Mr. Hopper was part of that. There was some breakdown there, and I think that it is very important for a parent to be there to raise concerns, things that may not be brought up, sitting on that side of the table. The other question, in regard to health impacts, if I understood it correctly, the health impacts are not studied at decommissioned sites, is that correct? Is that what you were saying? They're studied at active sites, or did I misunderstand that?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
I think I may understand what you're talking about. At the February 2nd meeting, Mr. Lockdown talked about an NRC initiative from probably about a decade ago.
Okay.
And it was to look at impacts, I believe, around operating sites.
Right.
And I believe Mr. Lockdown then went on to say that at some point that was discontinued.
Right, so nothing has been done in terms of looking at health impacts as sites have decommissioned or after sites have been decommissioned. I just don't know. It's an honest question.
So
This is Dave Lockbaum. Could I jump in and address it? What is done is they look at how much radioactivity goes out into the air and water, and how that radioactivity gets into soil, water, vegetation, things that people may inhale or consume. And that's estimated what the radiation dose is. What I think is missing is a health study to show that those limits are actually protecting the public, and there's not an increase in cancers and leukemias and other things that radiation can cause. It's presumed that those limits on how much goes out and how much gets collected is protecting the public, but they're not doing the final step to close that loop and then do the health study to confirm that that's the right assumption.
So I didn't
That's my view.
that's my question.
no, I think you raised it correctly as it was sort of discussed here this evening. There was a larger context to it at the earlier meeting. I actually understood what you were
Okay.
questioning.
Okay, so if that loop is not being closed, does Holtec study health impacts to their own employees as they're going? I'm sure, I mean, of course, they have safety, obviously regulations and such, but do they track health impacts to their employees years down the road? I'm just trying to see if we can use data from those instances, just to better understand.
Yeah, this is Dave Lockbaum again. The Holtec does not, but the broader community, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and National Cancer Institute and other federal colleagues have done those studies. And as a result of those studies, the limit on how much nuclear workers can be exposed to has been decreased several times over the years. The limit on how much the public can be exposed to has never been changed since it was set in the 1960s. And that's why I think the health studies of the public haven't been done to confirm that they got it right coming out of the box when they got it wrong for nuclear workers. Got it wrong several times for nuclear workers.
Right, and okay, so that also is concerning that the data for the public is decades old.
Yeah, I think, but in my presentation, that one slide where I showed, even if you cut the federal limit in half and increase the amount that's going out by a factor of 10, there'd still be margin. That provides me a little comfort that even though the limit may be wrong, it's there's so much margin to it that it's doubtful that the public is being harmed, even if the limit is wrong by half.
So if I could just add something, I'm Cindy Castellano of the State Health Department. There's been lots and lots and lots of studies done on the effects of radiation on people, starting back with the survivors of the nuclear explosions in Japan. They've looked at medical exposures over the years. They treat a lot of conditions with radiation, large thymuses in children. They used to treat ringworm on the scalp. I'm sorry, can you not hear me? I muted it instead of unmuting now, sorry. So I'll start right. So there's lots and lots of studies on health effects of radiation in humans, starting with Japanese bomb survivors, and then a lot of medical exposures. There's a lot of studies on inhaling radioactive materials, radon specifically from underground miners. So there's a ton of information out there. I mean, there's not probably a study about a decommissioned nuclear power plant. There's lots of studies on radiation health effects. There are international bodies, the International Council on Radiation Protection, that looks at all this stuff and sets standards. And then those standards that are set by that body or what gets adopted by the regulatory agencies as the values that are used in the regulations.
Are those values at all based on children?
So a long time ago, when they first started looking at this, they did what they call standard man, which is, you know, they just picked an average size man and they use those characteristics for those. As they've done more work, they split it up by age group and by sex. So if you look at the more recent reports, you can see they have things that they call like a dose conversion factor, where you can say if someone took in this much radioactive material, you would multiply it by this dose conversion factor to find out how much radiation dose they have. And they have different factors for different age groups and different sexes.
Thank you.
So I just also wanted to add to the last questioner's observations from an overall site-wide risk perspective, from a host community risk or a metropolitan area risk perspective, that the closure of the reactors has reduced the risk to this host community and to the metropolitan area. And I think on Dave Lockbaum's first or second slide, that was graphically represented. So the risk is, and this is what I said at the end of the meeting in February, and it was probably too late and may not have been like, you know, sometimes like when you're standing between folks and dinner or something like that, it may not necessarily get the uptake that you hope. But that second slide that Dave had and the reduction of risk is a substantial reduction of risk here for the metropolitan area. So from a severe accident perspective or severe accident mitigation alternative perspective, that risk is decreasing.
I do have two more people on the list, so we'll go right to Michelle Culo-Hill.
Hello. I too wasn't really prepared to ask a question, but sounded by accident, but I actually do have some questions. I also grew up in the area. I was actually at one of the other elementary schools, and I can just attest to the fact that we were told that it was never radioactive material that was put into the river. So my level of trust is not very high right now. You spent a lot of time talking about batch release in the summertime. I'm a little confused why you would do it in the summer when most people use and utilize the river in the summer and spend most of their time outside in the summer. You also talk about, you're basing a lot of this off of federal regulations. One of my questions, which I think you just answered, was, you know, there's been a lot of updates in medicine, in science. So when were these regulations made? I know you're saying that it's safe to drink the water. I mean, would you drink this water? when they release it into the river, would you, my son is on the crew team, would you go hop in his boat and row down the river or drink a glass of water as they're releasing this material? I know I wouldn't feel comfortable. Radioactivity stresses me out. It makes me very concerned. So when were these regulations made? Because what was safe in 1960 is definitely not safe now. I'm willing to bet that a lot of federal regulations that decisions were based off of have changed over the years. So if this is just based on 1960, why should we feel confident?
Thank you for your questions, and I'll, I caught a couple of them, I think I missed one. But just first on your comment about, getting lack of information. Or, I mean, one of the goals we have as the DOB, and it's still, we're a new body, we're building up, trying to be better and better every time, and we welcome the feedback. But one of the things we're doing is we know that the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission is not the best at providing information in the public sphere. It's not even the easiest website to navigate. We're trying to change that with ours to capturing those documents that are helpful, those monitoring reports that are helpful for you. And so we're capturing those, we're trying to help with our own forum to present that. Another question you had was on the regulations. I'll let Dave comment on that and perhaps John. But I'm sorry, you had a second question in there and I just.
I mean, basically, you're talking about how it would be safe drinking water. You're talking about how it would be safe to use and there's no need to stop. You're talking about doing it in the summer when most people are outside. What's your rationale?
Well, and just to be clear,
yeah,
it's not the rationale of anyone sitting at this table. Holtec indicated that they potentially will be initiating a controlled discharge, treated discharge in August or September, I think is what they stated at the last meeting.
When most people are in the water.
But and absolutely acknowledged your concern thinking about that. From what I understand of the water, first off, I'm not sure I drink Hudson water just at this point, only because I understand it could be brackish, and I'm not sure I want to drink that. Would I swim in it? I think I would, based on my understanding.
When they're having an active release?
Yes. Based
Can I
on.
hold you to it?
Yes. But based on the information I think Dave Lockdown presented earlier, it is, I think it's a fair question to have about whether or not limits should be revisited by the federal government. But at the levels at which there are discharges right now, I don't know if you captured this. It's I think less than 3% of the EPA's drinking water standard at the point of discharge. And the reason I want to highlight that point of discharge point is the fact that it takes over, it immediately greatly reduces to a much smaller fraction beyond that point of discharge. So it's absolutely, I think there's acknowledgement that radiation, there's a level of risk with everything. Our job is to focus on the lowest possible risk solutions.
Right, but I guess, sorry to interrupt, but you're also talking about how the risk is lower than when it's active from, a major event. But we're not looking at it from a major event perspective with the decommissioning. We're looking at it from the perspective of constant, being constantly exposed to this over a great period of time. And what I'm hearing is you guys haven't done a lot of studies about long-term health risks. You haven't done a lot of studies about cancer clusters. Again, the news that they've been discharging radioactive material for 60 years. I would really love to see a correlation with cancer clusters and that. I mean, I wouldn't like to see it with cancer clusters, but I would love to see a study that either proves or disproves a correlation with cancer clusters locally in the area, and see if there's any kind of way to correlate the discharge.
And actually, let me I just want to take a moment and offer Dave Lockbaum an opportunity here.
Sure.
And just want to highlight, I don't know, Dave, if you can talk about some of the other elements that were on one of your slides. Nuclear power plants are not the only source of radiation that enters the environment. And it's not saying that it's not something that we keep an eye on and the federal government keeps an eye on. What I want to.
But it's a controllable source that someone's making a lot of money off of while we're exposed and they're making a lot of money. So I would say it's not really fair to say there's all this other environmental radiation, because that doesn't justify adding the environmental radiation that people locally will be facing. But, and along those lines, you also mentioned how you'll alert the public. There are constant siren tests. I can tell you, anyone locally tunes them out because they assume it's not an issue. So if that's your only method of alerting people when there's an issue, good luck, because people will not pay attention. So I think you need to reevaluate that, especially if there's a potential for risk.
I know we're over time, and I just want to make sure we're answering your questions. So Susan, I know you can comment on some of I believe there's more than sirens.
Yeah, I'll just take one sentence, and then we can talk further if you'd like. We have a variety of different methods. That was one I used as an example.
Okay.
We have a myriad of ways to.
Okay, perfect. I mean, that was really a majority of it. I'm just looking at it from the perspective of the mom whose kid's going to be rowing right when they're releasing this stuff. So somewhat, please don't be offended by this comment, but honestly, unless you're in the boat with my son, I don't totally trust you. And I hope that you'll take the perspective of, would you put your son in this boat and would you give him a glass of this water? Because if you wouldn't, then you need to do better. So, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you for the question.
The last person on the list is Kristen Irwin.
Thank you. We talked about how shutting down this facility has reduced the risk for the greater area. But pushing forward with demolition activities when radioactivity is the highest, seems like we are increasing the risk for a large area of the region compared if we send this dust and debris into the air. Compounded with that is the fact that we have several gas pipelines traversing the property at Indian Point, and a 42-inch gas pipeline 400 feet from where we're presently standing. Massachusetts has a law that there's no pipelines within 1,000 feet of these types of facilities. So how can we justify detonating explosives to bring down reactor towers when the school's 400 feet from the gas pipeline that runs underneath of it?
So I heard a couple of questions in there. One was about the interstate gas pipeline, correct? And the other one was related to, I believe you used the word explosives.
Please tell me what word I should use.
Well, no, and the only
demolition of the towers.
As we mentioned before, this is absolutely a topic that we will be discussing at a future meeting, and we'll have the company there to describe what what methods they're going to use. My understanding is that there are more than one method and some are far less intrusive than something like an explosive, but I do not know. I have to find out from Holtec itself, and we'll absolutely discuss it at the future review.
Okay, at their February 2nd DOB meeting, Baroni said that they were going to plan to demolish those towers in December or sooner if they could work ahead of schedule. So that would have to be sooner than later, and I apologize, I was at work, so I didn't hear the beginning when you said the air monitoring systems would be installed. When is that? So under the community air monitoring plan, our goal is to get a contractor on board, allow that contractor time to do some baseline, and then get the monitoring in place prior to the heavy demolition. Okay, and then why isn't the Department of Education here? Why are they part of the board?
You mean New York State Department of Education? Actually, they're a member of the Indian Point Closure Task Force and have participated in our meetings. They're not at the table here today, but they have actually had regular communication with HENHA. On another question you had, I'm sorry, I was going to reply to another question.
That's okay, I'm fine with that answer. What would warrant a closure in the Department of Health's opinion?
But I'm sorry, I just want to make one clarification. There is currently continuous ongoing air quality monitoring, both at the site and off the site. In fact, there's a monitor very close to the school. It's for purposes of radiological monitoring, not other dust, et cetera. That will be part of the state program, but I did want to assure you that there is ongoing radiological monitoring that has been going on for decades.
Yes, I'm aware of that. Okay. And then we mentioned when Courtney asked about dust testing, we talked about that it's a scientific process, that we wouldn't need to investigate the dust unless there was a reason to. And as somebody who operated a linear accelerator for therapeutic dosage of radiation to cancer patients, we measured the output of that machine every day. We also measured the background radiation present in that room every day so that we could test for any variances. So for me, a scientific process that is sound is one that acquires a baseline. So that we have data to compare it to. If there were an event, we would have to have data to compare it to, so that we would know if there was a contamination event from the demolition of Indian Point. Nodding heads, thank you. We agree that we need dust testing in this school before any demolition activities take place.
We got a yes? Sorry.
Yeah, so I was nodding my head in regards to your comment about baseline, and that is what we're going to ask our consultant to do. We're also going to talk to our consultant about whether or not dust testing at BB school is something that will include in the plan. Okay, when the parents of children in Florissant, Missouri, when there was a spike in rare cancers and mortalities in their community, that was how they found the contamination at their school, was by dust testing, and that was granted after there was a class action lawsuit against the school district and that company. So I would make it, I would encourage everyone to ask for that we all need to advocate for that for the DOB. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. Okay, and then one last one. I appreciate this back and forth. This is so welcome, and I really, really appreciate everyone here does too. So we have conflicting evacuation plans between if there is an emergency at the nuclear power facility and if there's an emergency with the pipeline. So how do we reconcile the fact that sometimes we're told to shelter in place, other times we're told to evacuate, and this school is 400 feet from that 42-inch gas transmission.
Sure, thank you for the question. So
You're good.
So I would disagree with your characterization that they're conflicting. They're different. So evacuation and emergency response plans are different for different types of incidents. a response for a radiological incident is going to be different than a response for a fire from a gas pipeline incident. So you'll be notified as to the proper response based on the decisions of the incident commander at the site at the time. So they're not conflicting, they may be different, but the proper response will be determined by the incident that will drive what the proper response is.
I get the brochures, they're conflicting.
Those brochures, the brochures that we receive in the mail, they tell us to do different things.
If you want to show me some language, I will.
Okay, you will absolutely.
Email it to you, Susan, you can look back.
We will get you that email so that we can compare those directly.
Thank you.
Side by side.
Thanks so much. So Lisa, I believe that's, those are all the comments for this evening.
Right, well, thank you so much for your time this evening with us and for taking your time out of your evenings and travel to come here and be with us. Thank you very, very much. So, on behalf of the Inland PTA Advocacy Committee, we would like to thank you for coming tonight and everybody who's been here in our audience and listening online as well. For continuing to show your care and concern for each other in our community. We're currently working together our next forum, and we're going to be covering topics more in depth regarding the health and medical impacts of Indian Point closure. We'll share that information. Thank you so much. Now, do you have any comments as well?
No, just want to reiterate our gratitude for you organizing this event. Thank you again, and thank you everyone who participated in person and if you joined online. We really appreciate it. As you can see on this slide presentation here, there are a number of ways to submit comments. So by all means, feel free to use one of these. And again, on I believe the next slide, there's some more information on how to sign up for updates, and the following slide I believe is on how to access our website. So you're welcome to do that. Again, thank you all very much.